why do we need grand narratives? Why do we need to tell long stories of things happening? Why do we need to find the logic, if you like, in the historical processes by which we came to be where we are? There are many answers to that, and one of them is we cannot just be satisfied with what is here and now, with the hic et nunc of our existence. We cannot, because we are sense-seeking, meaning-seeking animals. So we need to find a meaning that goes beyond our own very short existence, and we need also to find a meaning that goes beyond the existence of our society as it exists now, so the people with whom we are interlinked in the figurations in which we are stuck, more or less, however dynamic they may be. And this pursuit of grand narratives, and I'm calling them grand, not great, for a reason. They may be great also. They may be encompassing, comprehensive. They may reach far beyond and far into the future. And there are so many excellent writers, with a special emphasis on writers, who have been producing these grand narratives recently. What is the grand narrative there in the history of reproductive rights? I'd say we have a succession of grand narratives in this field. The first grand narrative that developed gradually and in the 70s and 80s was certainly en vogue. It was a grand narrative of the universal progress. This was the time when reproductive rights were conceptualized anew. They were conceptualized as women's rights first, and then as human rights. The motto of women's rights are human rights. And then this narrative of the universal progress was very simple indeed. In fact, it was, a part, a figment of the general story of modernization spreading back into the early history of social sciences, into the early 20th century and into the Enlightenment antecedents of it. So this story went like this. The realization that there are reproductive rights will be followed by more and more access to various reproductive health services, by a better protection of these rights, by a more and more liberal approach to these rights, by extending them onto women and girls, all women, also unmarried women, and then, this was not in the 70s, but nowadays we could add onto other people who might not identify as women or men, but who nevertheless are also bearers of reproductive rights. So there was this expectation that this would happen. And as we all know, it did not happen. It happened, but only to an extent, and it was, staggering in some places, and then in many places it seemed to stop. So the universal progress went out of grace, and another grand narrative emerged, and it was the grand narrative of the clash of civilizations. And the patron saint for it is, of course, Samuel Huntington, but it does, again, go beyond Huntington. It was the realization that there are many ways to approach human rights and also reproductive rights all over the world, and these ways are, in fact, irreconcilable. So we have to cope with the fact that there is an essential diversity in this field, and the clashes will be there with us. But the clashes could even have been seen as something productive, as something that would, in a way, perversely support the cause of progress defined along the lines of the previous grand narrative, the one of the universal progress. So there were clashes, but the idea of progress was not quite extinguished. This concept of the clash of civilizations also in reproductive rights has also fallen out of grace. And then a series of unpleasant questions emerged very recently, over the last 10 years. How do we make sense of the turn against reproductive rights in many countries all over the world? In countries in Europe, in the European Union countries such as Hungary or Poland, in countries spreading over Europe and Asia such as Russia, in countries such as Brazil, Japan, Indonesia, in many African countries, including Senegal or Rwanda or Uganda, how do we perceive and how do we make sense of all these processes, where at the same time we can see that some change towards more liberalization is indeed constantly taking place. So there is the new grand narrative now, and one which I find personally entirely plausible. And this is the grand narrative of the conservative backlash. We find this grand narrative not only in the field of reproductive rights, it's also very prominent, for example, in memory studies. And the general gist of this story is as follows. There were liberals, however you define them, the advocates of progress, those who were working towards more liberalization, more equality, and also by extension by more globalization, more global standardization, all that which I covered basically in episodes 1, 2, and 3 of this video blog. And those people were not really aware of the social embedding of their ideas, or more precisely of the lack of social embedding of their ideas. So they were really not aware of the possible opposition against what they were advocating. And so, at some point in time, the critical mass of resistance and opposition was reached, and the conservatives, who were, up until that certain point, silent or marginalized or pushed away to the margins of political discourses, came forcefully back. And they came forcefully back, pushing against reproductive rights, making reproductive rights to a central point of their political agendas. Hence, the restrictions to abortion in Poland, hence the so-called heartbeat law in Hungary, hence the restrictions to the access to abortion in Latin American countries, and hence the problems with implementing access to abortion in many African countries, such as Senegal or Mozambique, or many others. It is a grand narrative that I, as said, find entirely plausible. It explains a lot. It explains the support for the anti-liberal approach to reproductive rights. There is, however, one problem that I find with a grand narrative like that, as with any other grand narrative. It is largely insensitive to the local context. It is largely insensitive to the local variation of the circumstances from which the conservative backlash emerges. These are not the same cultures, these are not the same values and attitudes and habitus that fuel conservative backlash in post-communist East Central Europe, in Muslim African countries, and in the countries like the US, with their story of religious controversy and of litigious legal culture. So when we are following the grand narratives, when we are inspired by them, it is very important to keep our eyes open to the detail, to keep our eyes open to what is happening locally, and to bear in mind that there are limits to comparison, limits to generalization, and limits that our reason needs to put to our meaning-seeking for all price.